Welcome to Wartime Cafe. We are in Mizyan Restaurant on Hamra Street. This is episode 15 of our show, and we have with us Steve Sweeney, RT correspondent in Lebanon. Steve, thank you for being with us. Welcome to Lebanon.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Not a lot of people probably know about your background here, so we're going to start with the basics so the global audience knows your history and your amazing work. And then we'll get to the latest, as usual, in the political scene, specifically on your expertise in media production and being in so many war zones. So, Steve, you are a British citizen. You are of Irish background. That you also have been working in media for a long time. You started your career with the independent newspaper, the Morning Star in the UK. Why do you think work in independent media is important in such a landscape of media in the West? What drove you to this media activism in the beginning of your career?
Well, I mean, the answer to the first question is very simple. I think independent media is absolutely crucial now in terms of the current situation globally, because of course there are conflicts across the world. The imperialist forces are waging wars in this region in particular, but also in Ukraine. These are, we have to define them as what they are. These are wars led by imperialism for control of those regions. And of course, the imperialist powers don't act alone. They have a whole arsenal behind them, and one of the most important arsenals that they have is the media. We know that the mainstream media, if you want to use that particular term, but we're talking about the well-established organizations, whether it's CNN in the United States or the BBC in Britain, and the newspapers, the Telegraph, the Times, all of these media organizations are not independent. That's the point of them. The role that they play is softening up public opinion to support these wars, distorting the truth on the ground, distorting the reality of what's happening, or simply ignoring it. So that by omission, they're acting as the arbiters of truth. They're the people that what they say, and of course, because they have a long established history, and I'll talk about Britain really because that's the area that I know the best. The BBC, for example. Auntie Beeb, it's called. It's like a member of the family. That's how they sort of create and build this myth around the corporation. And they kind of say it's the standard bearer of media across the world. But the history, if you look at it, is anything but the truth. In fact, it's the opposite. It's played a role. It's controlled by the British states, and of course the British state is an imperialist power. A junior one now to America. Is really the lapdog of American imperialism. Britain doesn't have any kind of independence. It has no independent foreign policy. It just follows slavishly the US line. So we've seen a lot over the years. We could probably spend an hour talking really about the role of the BBC in whether it's in the Iraq War, whether it was in the miners' strike during the 1980s, and right back to its inception when it was commandeered by the state to against the people in the general strike. So there's a long history, and of course, when it comes to Israel and what Israel is doing, again, it's been quite openly supportive of Israel and Israel's action. Israel just has to pick up a phone and demand that they change a headline.
We're going to get to that.
So I'm sure we're going to come onto that and the role of the media.
You started with the Morning Star, which is a newspaper that is supported by the labor unions in the UK.
Exactly.
And its majority of its readership is labor unions and people affiliated with the workers' rights. And
the history of the Morning Star, it started as a daily worker back in 1930, and it was then the newspaper of the Communist Party of Great Britain, as was. And I think it was later down the line, the 1940s. I mean, it went through a series, obviously, again, it was a very important, it had quite a high circulation back in the day there, but it was, of course, subjected to state interference, the editorial board arrested and put in prison, attempts to close the newspaper down. There's been many of those, bombed by the Nazis, spied on by the intelligence services. So it's been through a lot, and it was a testament really that it still survives today, because it's the first thing they said after the first edition was published. Somebody was saying, well, is that damn newspaper still coming out? And 90 odd years later, yes, it is. But it existed in that milieu, and over the years it's had some fantastic writers. It's broken some big stories. We had Claude Coburn was reporting from the ground in the Spanish Civil War. This was he left the Times to join the Daily Worker as it was then. But it plays a very important role, as you said. It's supported by the trade unions. They are shareholders.
So how did you come to the Morning Star? Was that the first time that you got involved in media production, or you already?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I was writing before then. It'd been my kind of ever since I was a kid. I wanted to be a journalist. Right? What a nerd, right? But I did want to do other things. I wanted to be a professional footballer, an astronaut, the usual kind of things. But journalism and writing was my thing. So I was writing independently. And then I started writing for the Morning Star, but an occasional column rather than working for them as a full-time journalist. And then it kind of developed from there. I was writing more and more. And, they said, well, we'd like you to join our team on the reporting side. So I started as a reporter on the home desk. Our coverage was different from what you're seeing in the mainstream media. So we were kind of covering, I don't know, for example, huge pro-Palestine protests. We were covering that, but more than covering it, we were kind of part of it, and we saw the paper as a tool of the movement, and that's kind of how we used it in a I guess, an agitational way, really, to try and get the stories that weren't being portrayed in the mainstream media. And we were, I think that in terms of circulation, of course, mainstream media dominate. They have millions and they have billionaire backers, and they're distributed across the country. And of course, we didn't have that. We didn't have that kind
of. So the Morning Star comes out once a week?
No, every day. It's a daily newspaper, except on the weekend.
Which is very rare amongst these independent newspapers.
Well, it's difficult. It's very difficult to do, to produce a newspaper and to keep a newspaper going. If you started a newspaper now, it would cost you millions of pounds to get it off the ground. And we've seen it in Britain. A few years ago, there was an attempt to start a brand new newspaper, and it folded within 2 or 3 months. So it relies on the goodwill of the readers who buy it, the trade union movement, who again put a lot of funds into it. So and that's the beauty of it. It's an independent newspaper, as in it's not controlled by a media baron and this kind of thing. So, but the influence it has is bigger than the circulation. So I think it's around 30,000 a day, which it's not a small number, but it's not as big as the mainstream media. But because of the stories that we write and the coverage that we have, it's really appealing to those kind of active layers of society, the people that will actually go out and do stuff, that will see what we're writing and take some kind of action. So it's kind of, we always saw it as part of the movement, not just reporting on the movement, but a part of
these two comments that you made, one on how hard it is to publish something, a newspaper on a daily basis, reminds me, number one, my brother has a printing company in Canada. And after the breakout of the Arab Autumn, there was all these newspapers that popped up across the Arabic world,
Yeah.
in Tunis and other places. And they were all looking for the web paper, to print the newspapers on. And there's only two big suppliers in the world, and one of them is a Canadian supplier. It's Quebecor Corporation that New York Times and Washington Post and Chicago, all Tribune, all of them get printed on their paper. And he tried to export web paper rolls to these newspapers, and the Canadian intelligence stopped him from exporting the paper and actually said that you need a permit from Canadian intelligence to export the paper rolls. So it is definitely, there's a lot of obstacles in front of somebody publishing a daily newspaper. The other thing that you mentioned there, and I think this is where I would like your commentary on, when we're talking about media being connected to movement, we know our enemies, the mainstream media, are connected to actual movements, meaning parties and intelligence services and billionaires and so on, and drive there. But when we look at the plethora of quote-unquote independent, progressive media out there, we see almost a total disattachment from movement. There is very rarely something like the Morning Star that is openly and directly involved in the organizing and representing that organizing. And so what's your opinion about the majority of this independent quote-unquote media that is out there when it's refused to attach itself directly to movements?
I think when you look at independent media, there's a number of things that I see happening now, and because a lot of the independent media is online, and that's the kind of the milieu that they operate in and they function in, and I think it's harder in a way. When social media was in its infancy and it became a kind of a platform for independent media, and it was getting the kind of messages that are not carried in the mainstream media to fairly big audiences and active audiences. And I think that as it developed, the intelligence services played a role in developing social media. Let's be honest about it. So of course they have a vested interest in watching what's happening, and some of this. Independent media is quite a broad. It's a very broad term. So you have some independent media. I'm thinking in terms of Britain, something like Novara Media, for example. When it started out, it was fresh, it was new, it was dynamic, it tapped into that, the rise of Jeremy Corbyn. It wasn't necessarily attached to a movement.
Although they criticized Jeremy Corbyn.
That's what I was going to say, because they moved into that space that had opened up where independent media were now getting more of a voice, and they tapped into that. But of course, they were very critical of Jeremy Corbyn. They bought into the whole anti-Semitism, what do you want to call it, a psyop or however you describe it, but it was this fake anti-Semitism chart that anybody that criticized Israel or was pro-Palestinian was instantly anti-Semitic, and they kind of bought into that. So when the independent media, because they did have a big following, and they still do have a big following and a big audience, but of course then they end up being completely co-opted and bought off by the intelligence services or the establishment, whatever you want to call it. So the independent media have a very difficult position, really, in terms of the media landscape, because when they're doing well, they're bought off. And of course, the algorithms and the social media platforms are now more tightly controlled, I think, than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Even AI now involved.
Exactly. So it's a difficult landscape to try and traverse, I think. And you're seeing with a lot of what you would say is good quality on-the-ground journalism, or even just people, the voices of the people that are in the affected areas, whether it's the West Bank, whether it's Gaza, whether it's southern Lebanon, whether it's in Ukraine, those voices are stifled because the platforms that existed previously no longer exist. they can fix the algorithm. So something original and on the ground. And if it's something that goes against the mainstream narrative or the narrative of the establishment, then they can softly, shadow ban it or make sure that it gets a very, very low view. So I think in terms of attachment to movements, I don't know what movements that they would attach themselves to, because at the moment the main movement is the pro-Palestine movement. And anything that's attached to the pro-Palestine movement is either anti-Semitic or terrorism, or pro-terrorism, or
in the eyes of the establishment. Yes.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean that's what I'm saying. I don't believe that at all. But that's how they portray it, as they're deemed to be anti-Semitic. And how many times now? I mean, I've lost count of the number of people that have had YouTube channels closed down, that have had Twitter accounts closed down, blocked by Facebook, because for daring to speak the truth or to show the truth. And I think it's for other journalists or social media activists or whatever you want to call them, they'll have that in mind. And so instead of being bold and being brave and going against that, they have one eye or part of their mind on, well, if I say this, then I'm going to be cancelled on this platform. This platform that is my income, because of course, again, that's another element of it is that you'll find
themselves within the confines of
exactly. They keep themselves in a exactly that window or whatever has narrowed now so much of what's acceptable. Even in the last 5 or 10 years, it's what's acceptable to say and not acceptable. I worked and spent a long time in Donbass reporting on the conflict there.
Before we go there, because this is very important to talk about your experience in Russia. When you mentioned Navarno media and their betrayal of Corbyn, and in general also in October 7th, they made that same stupid attacks on the Palestinian resistance, supporting those lies about rape and murder of children. You had an experience the opposite of that, working at the Morning Star, because of your support for Jeremy Corbyn during his time as the leader of the Labour Party.
Yeah.
You had Mark Regev, the ex-ambassador of the Zionist colony to the UK, harassing you, asking for space in your own newspaper. Can you tell us about this story?
Yeah, of course. Well, this was back in, I think now 2019. So people probably forget now. But in 2019, of course, Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party. We were coming into a general election period. So there was a possibility that Jeremy Corbyn could have been the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And of course, his views on Palestine are very well known. He said he would recognise a Palestinian state, which no party leader, let alone Labour Party leader, had ever said in the past. So this is part of the reason why we saw the anti-Semitism slurs against him, the slander, and against the supporters of him, both inside and outside the Labour Party. So they knew how important really the Morning Star was as a newspaper, because it was backed by Jeremy Corbyn, and it backed Jeremy Corbyn, and vice versa. So it was important coming in the run up to that election, because Labour Party conference. It was the last Labour Party conference before the election. The election was just weeks after the Labour Party conference. The newspaper, as we know, I said, is backed by the trade union movement, backed by the Labour movement. So at Labour Party conference, the paper was going into the hands of every single person at Labour Party conference. We're talking about 1,500, 2,000 people. And these are the people, again, they're the most active players within the Labour Party. These are the people that are, branch secretaries or, hold positions, councillors, this kind of thing. So these were key people. And so he realised that. And there was a big debate within the party at the time over Israel and Palestine. Again, the arguments that we're hearing now they started then. It was the anti-Semitism stuff, and if you're pro-Palestinian, you're pro-terrorist, all of this kind of thing. But the active layers, because you remember hundreds of thousands of people joined the Labour Party to support Jeremy Corbyn, and that meant hundreds of thousands of Labour Party members were pro-Palestine, and there were huge Palestinian flags being displayed on the conference floor. So Mark Regev, I'd been away, I'd been covering another conference. I came back to my office. I sat down and, you have like 1,000 emails to get through. About 5 minutes after I arrived, the phone rang. And hello, I'm the assistant to Mark Regev, the Israeli ambassador to Britain. We've sent you an article and written by Mark, and we want it published in the paper tomorrow. I said, okay. I said, I haven't seen the email, and I explained, I'm going through, obviously I have to prioritize which ones I go through. I'll have a look at it, and I'll get back to you when I've read it. 5 minutes later, he called again. Have you read the email from Mark Regev about the article? It must go in the Morning Star.
You didn't read it fast enough. You must be anti-Semitic.
Exactly, yeah. But the more he called, the lower down it was in my list of priorities to read, because he was annoying me. But this went on for I guess an hour. He was every 5 or 10 minutes. He was calling me. Finally, I read it, and how can I describe it? It was a work of fantasy, a work of fiction. And he was talking, I think the title was something about why socialists should support Israel, trying to portray Israel as a progressive society. And he started talking about the birth of the kibbutz movement. And he was, the way that he portrayed the kibbutz movement was, it was like some really happy hippie commune. It was really progressive. But the reality, of course, is very different. Kibbutzism was central to the expansion of the colonialist Israeli state. That's exactly what it was. It was an integral part of that, and also an integral part of the military-industrial complex. What people may not realise what they were actually making in these kibbutzes. They weren't independent. They were tied to not all of them, but some of them were tied to the military-industrial complex. So, of course, he didn't say any of this in his article. It was a pure fantasy. But what he was trying to do was to swing people into why they should support Israel, and really why they should not support Jeremy Corbyn. Anyway, I reviewed his article and decided it wasn't suitable for publication. And eventually I gave him this response. I gave the assistant this response. I guess within 5 minutes, Mark Regev himself phoned, and he called me, and he lost his shit down the phone to me. He was shouting, "This is a disgrace, we should be in block." And I ended up saying, no, sorry, we've reviewed it and it's not suitable for publication. Thank you very much. And I treated it the same as anybody that submitted any article. He didn't get any special favours because of his position. But I think really that was the crux of it. I think because Mark Regev has phoned the BBC, and the BBC would just change a headline. Or he'd phone the Telegraph and say, I want an article in tomorrow, and he'd get an article in tomorrow. They just bent over backwards.
So they're used to, as Zionists, to have all the media follow their dictates and tiptoe around them and be scared of them.
Exactly, yeah.
And they were shocked when the Morning Star and yourself refused that.
He's obviously never read it before, because the line of the paper is pro-Palestine. It's very obvious and very clear.
Did they campaign against you after? Did they make statements calling you names or anything like that?
No, nothing like that. I mean, if they had, I don't think it would have made any impact. The only impact it would have had was probably to make us more popular amongst our readership. They have no influence over us, no influence over our readers, and I think that was what they were most upset about, because again, this was on the crux of a general election. That was why they were so adamant and so desperate to get this article into the newspaper. I think if we'd have published it, it would have caused uproar. I think people would have, our supporters and our readers would have been.
You're just you have to admit you're anti-Semitic. You're blocking the voices of Jewish people.
Yeah, it's terrible, isn't it?
It's terrible. You came here to Lebanon in 2019, 2020?
2020, yeah.
2020,
2020.
2020. And you were, at the time, the foreign desk
I was the international editor at the
international
newspaper,
editor at the Morning Star. When you were here last time, the economy had crashed. We had the port explosion. Situation wasn't that great, but now there's a full-out war. What's the difference that you see between the two times you were here?
Well, there are very obviously huge differences between the situation then and now. The situation, as you said, it was pretty dire then. But I think the difference was this was the economic crash, the huge crash. The port explosion had not long happened. I think 6 months before I came, the port explosion happened, and the economic situation was already pretty bad then. We'd seen the huge protests exploding on the streets, of course, ended up being co-opted as these movements so often are. And I think that was the thing. There was the difficulties with electricity, with mazout, with the gas, huge queues at petrol stations, and there was very serious threats that hospitals may run out of electricity, and the situation was pretty desperate, and people were kind of, from my experience anyway, people were more concerned with day-to-day living and how they were going to access medicine and food and water and this kind of thing. So, but the situation wasn't anything like it is now, of course. I mean, the situation was pretty dire, but then I was going to say you had a functioning government in Lebanon, but there wasn't.
There's never been a functioning government.
There's never been a functioning government in Lebanon, but you know, I don't think it was quite as bad as things are now. In that respect, this paralysis and no president, and the political manoeuvring that's going on. And the political manoeuvring was obviously going on then. It always is, and the shifting alliances and this kind of thing. But there was a little bit more stability within. Certainly, like within the various party groupings, this kind of thing.
So you mentioned there, obviously with the economic crash, how some sectors of society here were, out in the streets. They were also being manipulated by outside forces,
by the NGOs,
and it got very heated with the attacks on a few ministries by some of these paid demonstrators.
Yeah, I was there.
Today we're in the midst of a full-out war.
Yeah.
And do you see more social cohesion in Lebanon than that moment, or less?
Well, in a way, yes. I mean, that's the kind of the overriding thing. When I've been back here now for, I guess, 5 or 6 weeks, so I'm sort of getting used to the feel on the ground. But I've been around a lot of the different areas, the shelters, the camps, speaking to people there. And the overriding message actually is one of unity, and how the people of Lebanon. Somebody once said to me in one of the camps that the people here are unbreakable, and I think that's certainly true considering the history of what's happened in Lebanon. But people were talking about one of the main issues here is this attempt to break the people. And you see this with the language of Netanyahu, what he's trying to, he was making these statements a few weeks ago describing the Shia community as the enemy within, and trying to strike fear of the Shia community. And you can see why, because the Israeli troops, when they announced this limited ground invasion, or however they described it, whatever term they used, has been an absolute failure. Now, you knew it would be a failure. I knew it would be a failure. Anybody who knows the resistance knew it would be a failure. But they seem to think that that they were going to be able to march into southern Lebanon, push Hezbollah back across north of the Litani River. They would take control of all the village. They genuinely thought that this was the case, I think, and but it's been a huge disaster. They can't get so much of a toe across the border, as we call it.
45 days.
Yeah, without being pushed back and facing these huge casualties, these huge losses. And I don't know if people in the West are even aware of this, of what's actually happening in southern Lebanon. I think that there's a lot of obviously there's a lot of misinformation, but you have the media not just backing Israel, but they're joining the Israeli forces incursions into Lebanese territory and reporting from the ground there. And the tales that they're coming out with, they're just parroting their IDF or IOF press releases, press statements. They just believe everything they say and parrot it. But so that's why they're trying to portray the Shia community as the enemy within, because they know they can't win on the ground. They know there's no way that they can really hold any territory or even gain any territory. And the only thing that they have is air superiority, which is why we're seeing now the bombing of Dahiya. I mean, the copybook has been written, the Dahiya doctrine. That's what we're seeing now. Back in 2006, we saw it. We've seen it then rolled out in Gaza, and we're seeing it come full circle back again now. So they have air superiority, which is why they're bombing civilian buildings, residential areas. They keep insisting that they're targeting Hezbollah, but we know they're not. And we go to these areas where the bombs are striking, and we go there, and what do we see? Hospitals, residential blocks. The main victims now, and I think that there's been a report that suggested the majority of the people that have been killed are women and children.
Both here and in Gaza.
But yeah, in both places.
And the difference between all of the international, mainstream media coverage and your work is that you are on the field.
Yeah.
And you started with RT covering the war in Ukraine, in Donbass and Crimea and so forth.
Yeah.
And so, this idea that the Zionists can just roll in and do whatever they want to, and similarly, we saw that happening with Ukraine and the West NATO thinking that they can just do whatever they want to. So let's talk about this superiority complex that the West has and the Zionists have, and the reality that you saw on the ground, both in, let's start with Ukraine, the war there.
With Donbass, I mean, I'll tell you the story about how I came to RT, because that I initially went. I was at the Morning Star at the time, and I came into Western Ukraine. And what I was doing was a couple of stories that I wanted to cover, and they needed a little bit further investigation. But I was looking at NATO bases inside Western Ukraine. There was a strike on one of them, and there was a huge cover-up in the media. They said only a few people were killed, but I knew that hundreds had been killed, and I knew this from my investigative work, that hundreds of people had been killed, and they were NATO Western. NATO officers and soldiers from the NATO states. They were in this base, and so I crossed in from Poland. I got a coach from Warsaw into Lvov, and as I got on the coach, actually the coach was full of people in military uniforms. The guy sitting opposite me had a tattoo of a gun on his face, and I thought, this guy's not going on holiday. He's and he had military fatigues on. He growled at me quite a lot throughout the journey. But as I got off the coach, you could see Lvov was full of mercenaries. Essentially, that's what it was, and they did it in a very clever way. Well, we could call it clever or not, I don't know. Well, what they would do was disguise themselves as NGOs. So they would set themselves up as we're coming to provide medical care to soldiers on the front line. We've got all of these packs, these medical kits. We're providing aid and support. Every single one of them were active combatants. They weren't going there to provide medical aid. Of course, they had some with them, as they do. But these NGOs, and we can talk about the Nachtigall, the Nightingale, which was set up by Mason Gifford, who was well known for his links to British and American intelligence services. He's a former Tory councillor, city banker, very well connected to that kind of world. And of course, he became a combatant. And then there were the Dark Angels, who again they were again portraying themselves as an NGO, humanitarian aid. and they were caught. Well, actually, the Sun newspaper embedded themselves with them and filmed them firing an RPG at a Russian tank. So, you know, so these people were made very, very welcome there. I was not made very welcome there. They went there with guns. So if I'd have gone there with guns to kill Russians with, I'd have been very welcome, had the red carpet rolled out for me. But what happened to me was I was met off the coach, and they said, Mr. Sweeney, we know exactly who you are. You're a communist. I am, yeah, okay. You're a traitor. Okay, a traitor to who, I don't know, and a spy. And I was none. The only one I was a communist. And they said, we're going to take you away now. And they said that they were going to torture me. And one of them drew his like this, so they're indicating they were going to kill me. But they're not the sharpest tools in the box. They're not they didn't take my passport off me. They didn't put me in cuffs or anything. So I just thought, fuck you. And I ran.
You made a run for it.
I made a run for it.
Yes.
And I kind of anticipated there might be some trouble. So I made a run for it. I had a hooded top on. I just put my hood up and ran. And, you know, I'm an old man now. I can't run as fast as I used to be able to. But on that day, somehow, the adrenaline kicked in and I was gone. And then I made my way out of that part of Ukraine, back into Poland and down to Germany. And then RT got hold of my story. They heard it, and then it sort of went from there. Really, they said, "Well, would you like to come and work?"
Yeah, they offered you the job to cover.
So yeah, so I did. So I started at RT, moved to Moscow, which is a fantastic city. Highly recommend it to anybody that's not been there. It's not as it's portrayed in the West and the Western media. It's a very modern, advanced city. The people are very friendly, and the people in Russia generally support Putin as well. This is, of course, every time that there's a conflict, they have to create a bogeyman, the new Hitler, and this kind of thing. But this is not.
So when you got to Donbass,
yeah.
You definitely probably saw the opposite of what we see in the mainstream media. Describe to us the situation for the civilians.
So the situation for civilians in Donbass didn't start. There's two key dates for the West, and that's one of them is October the 7th, which is when they think everything started in Gaza and Palestine, and the other is February 2022. Where they believe that Russia invaded Ukraine.
Well, they want everybody to believe.
That's what they want to believe, those things.
Yes.
And of course, we know that's not true. I mean, decades and decades of the oppression of Palestinians, the theft of their land, and the colonialist expansion of Israel. And likewise, particularly in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, I mean, again, there's decades of history which we haven't got time to sort of go into the complexities of that. But very simply, when I went into Donbass, what you're seeing is every single day, without fail, civilian areas were being shelled and bombed using Western weapons every day. And these aren't targeted; they're not military targets. These are civilian areas, all of them, without fail. They're targeting hospitals. They're targeting even bus stops. People waiting for a bus. They're kind of some of them in the very poorest areas of Donetsk city, for example. And I was living in and among these people. They were my friends. They were people that I knew. And the only criticism they actually had of Russia, and they were very supportive of Russia. They identify as Russians. Some of them will say that they're Ukrainian, but they speak Russian. And they want to be part of Russia. Now, but the only criticism they had was Putin didn't come in, Russian troops didn't come in early enough. And how they view things is very different from how the West and the Western media portray it. And they know that they support Russian troops because they see them as a bulwark against genocide. They know that if the Russian troops leave, they know what's going to happen to them. The Ukrainian troops will march into those areas and they will massacre everybody. They will start the biggest pogroms you can imagine. And they know that this is the case because they openly tell them that this is going to happen. They say that anybody that is pro-Russian, anybody that's in these territories, they deem as traitors or conspiring with the enemy, this kind of thing. So the situation there, I mean, it has settled down a little bit now because of the presence of the Russian troops and the huge advances that they're making on the front lines, which has pushed the Ukrainians back so that they can't target those areas as regularly and as frequently as they do, although it is still happening every day. So every day a war crime is being committed in Donbass.
It's very funny how... sorry, go ahead.
So I just want to make this point because the West, the collective West, not just the establishment, but also the left, the trade unions, and those people that would describe themselves as progressive, from day one, every single one of them fell in line with that narrative that Russia are invaders, that Russia is evil, that Russian troops must leave, and we must support the poor Ukrainians. And, you know, they say on the one hand, you know, these people will say they support the right to self-determination. Okay, this is an important concept. The Palestinian people have the right to self-determination, yet they deny that right of self-determination to the people in Donbass. So I would always say, look, Donbass is like Palestine, right? The struggles are the same. They're the same kind of struggles for basic rights. You know, in Donbass, it's the right to speak their own language, the right to practice their own culture, the right to identify as Russian, the right to govern their own affairs. All of the, you know, these basic concepts, basic human rights actually enshrined in international law. That's what they want, and they were denied all of that. The Russian language was banned. There's statues of anybody associated with Russia being torn down across cities, and then marching in were neo-Nazis, and the West denies that there are neo-Nazis, but you see it everywhere. Well, you know, and they'll make all sorts of excuses, but now they're completely integrated into the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian government. You know, they've become absorbed into it. Azov are now part of the National Guard. They've given, and you know, they say there are no Nazis in Ukraine, but we keep seeing every single time you see Ukrainian soldiers, with neo-Nazi tattoos, giving the Sieg Heil salute. We see statues of Stepan Bandera, a neo-Nazi, a Nazi collaborator, a Nazi sympathizer. He's venerated, and even his birthday is celebrated with marches in the street. There are camps for children that are run by neo-Nazis in Ukraine. This is a fact. This isn't something that's a fantasy, but all of that's covered up. They talk about freedom and democracy. What freedom and democracy are they talking about?
It's all non-existent right now.
All political parties in Ukraine are shut down.
And look, one thing about the situation in Ukraine, since we're sitting right here in Lebanon, is very similar to the situation in Lebanon historically. Why? Because first off, let's be very clear, there is no such thing as a Ukrainian language. Ukrainian is just an accent of Russian. It's just like Lebanon and Syria are one. Ukraine and Russia are one. Kiev is the original capital of the Russians. Yeah, exactly. And what we saw with the colonialists trying to separate Lebanon from Syria was exactly what we saw in Ukraine. Yeah. They raised the fascist phalange here, the Nazis in Lebanon, to fight against the Christian and Muslim Lebanese that wanted unification with Syria from the beginning, from 1940s. And we saw how those Nazis, the phalange, slaughtered their Christian brothers and sisters here in Lebanon in order to serve Israel. And now we see it in the Ukraine. It's the same playbook. Ultimately, geography and history rule. All these supremacist ideas that are in the heads of the West will not work out. Ukraine will return to be Russia. Lebanon will return to being unified with the rest, even if it takes 100 years as it's taking right now. Yeah. I'm going to take this moment to, look at, since you arrived here and you've been visiting all these locations that are getting attacked, your impression of the strategies of the Israelis in their campaigns and how the resistance is responding.
Well, the resistance has a very clear strategy, and it's a strategy that they're sticking to. They're not, they're not being, they're not deviating from their path, and that, their strategy is, resisting Israeli attempts incursion. What the Israeli strategy is, well, they want control of. They want to destroy southern Lebanon. They want to make it uninhabitable, so that the people that have been pushed out of there by the bombing, by the aggression, can't come back. And then they want, they want to expand and create this greater Israel. This is again, again the similarities with what's happening in Ukraine. But Israel has probably underestimated the resistance, I think, and the only thing that they can do, as we were discussing, we started touching upon earlier, and we started seeing these statements soon after I came, actually. I think the first person that mentioned it was the French defense minister, who said that there was, Lebanon is on the brink of collapse and a civil war is imminent. I heard that, I read it, and I thought, well, okay, this isn't true, but this is wishful thinking. And it gave a little bit of an insight into their strategy, not just of Israel, because Israel, on its own, without the United States and without the backing of the imperialist forces, as Hassan Nasrallah and Naim Qassem have said, it wouldn't last even a month without that support. Israel has, is built on sand, and once that, if they lose that support, of course, we know it's an imperialist proxy state. That's exactly what it is. It's a U.S. base in this region. So the strategy now seems to be, and we, like I said before, with this portrayal of the Shia community as the enemy within, and you see them, for example. Now we've seen large numbers of people from the south here. Large numbers of those obviously are from the Shia community. But they're being embraced by the people here. They're not being shunned. They're not being turned away. They're being embraced by the people here. We saw it in A2, in the Batroun region, when 22 civilians, 22 people that had had their homes bombed in the south came to what they thought was a place of safety in a Maronite Christian village. And of course, Israel then decided they were bombing that village. Now, there were a number of things, in my view. I'm not an expert, but this is how I saw it, certainly, that there were a number of things here. Of course, they said they were targeting a Hezbollah commander who I don't believe was even in the area at the time, but this is the smokescreen that they used to justify this kind of attack. But they were trying to say a number of things. One, that you're not safe anywhere you go in Lebanon. Two, to turn communities against each other and for them to say, well, these people are dangerous, and if we harbour them, if we give them shelter, then we become targets as well. I think it's failing. But also, again, Slimane Frangieh was very strongly associated with this area, and he is a potential for this vacant post of president. Now, the strategy of Israel and the West and the United States, and we've seen this with this huge flurry of diplomatic activity. Everybody and anybody was making their way to Beirut in the run-up to the presidential election in the United States. They were talking about UN Resolution 1701, but of course they weren't talking about UN Resolution 1701. It was a UN Resolution 1701 plus, which was entirely on their terms, which what they want to do as well. Before we talk about a ceasefire, you have to have a president, but you have to have a president of our choosing. Joseph Aoun was the original name that was mentioned, the commander of the Lebanese army, which I understand. I don't know. I don't know much about the Lebanese constitution, but it would have required a constitutional change. But they're trying to break that from the. They're trying to make the presidency free from break it from the resistance, and the people of Lebanon have rejected that. That's it. Nabi Berri, I think, is, in my view anyway, he's doing a superb job in holding that line as the Speaker of Parliament. So if you remember when Hochstein.
The Israeli officer, that's the special envoy.
Exactly, the special envoy. When he arrived in Beirut, he left with his tail between his legs. Nabi Berri said, "No, we're not accepting what was in essence a surrender document." That's what they presented as their terms for a ceasefire. But if you remember, that evening, all of a sudden, and Nabi Berri is from the Amal movement, all of a sudden, Jinnah was attacked for the first time. A residential building was attacked. More than 20 families, 20 people, families, ordinary people, were killed in that strike. And that area has an association with Amal. And then the next day, well, Yoav Gallant said the Sahel hospital is storing Hezbollah gold and dollars. This has been stolen from the Lebanese people. It's in the basement of this hospital. Now, where have we heard that before? This was exactly what we saw with Al-Shifa and the hospitals in Gaza. They were linking them to Hamas, of course, to justify attacks on them and strikes on them. But of course, the director of the Sahel hospital, who I met, is an Amal MP. So those things were very, very clearly linked. This was if you don't do what we say, we're going to come for you. And then, of course, they started carpet bombing Tyre as well. So again, associated with Nabi Berri. But people won't necessarily have made that link because they won't know the intricacies of Lebanese politics. I went into the Sahel hospital twice. I went there.
That report got a lot of traction. A lot of people watched it around the world.
It did get a lot of traction, actually. We went the first day we went into the hospital. We went into the basement, and I can tell you, and if you've seen the footage, I was given free access everywhere in that hospital. Nobody followed me. If I had any questions, they were happy to answer them. Walk around, open any door. And I did. I walked around, and all that you saw in there was the same things that you'd see in any hospital in any country in the world. It was very obvious there was no Hezbollah gold there. And I did a thorough search, I have to say. I did a very thorough search. But then that evening,
so you couldn't find the.
I was disappointed.
The Hezbollah.
I was hoping
pot of gold.
I was hoping to come back. I was hoping to come back with at least a tiny bit of gold and some dollars, but no, I didn't find it. I didn't find anything. But that evening, Yoav Gallant then said, the reason these journalists didn't find the Hezbollah gold, not because it wasn't there, they were looking in the wrong place, and to prove that we were looking in the wrong place, he produced this CGI graphic, which said, well, they didn't go in these are the entrances where the Hezbollah gold is. So of course I thought, well, okay, I'll go back the next day. So I went back the next day, and I went into both of those areas where they said the Hezbollah gold was. I'll tell you what I found there. In one of them was an empty car park. Oh, it had one van in it. I found some men loading shirts onto a van. I looked in the boxes. There was a garage where people were carrying out repair work on motorcycles, and it had exactly the same kind of things that you'd find in any garage anywhere. And I was asking them, have you seen this gold anywhere? And there was nothing there, no gold there. And again, we did a thorough search. Again, they once we debunked all of this, it was a few days later, they came out with a new theory that actually there's a wall, and behind this wall is the Hezbollah gold, the dollars, and Hassan Nasrallah's lair. But people bought into this. They were saying genuinely.
So it's like the rainbow.
Yeah, exactly.
They're trying to find, but it keeps on moving.
It keeps moving. Every time you get closer, it gets further away.
The Zionist leprechaun is pretty nasty.
It was great. But they were asking us to look in places that simply didn't exist. Why would you believe Israel, with its history of lying about this kind of stuff, this whole concept of Hasbara, this spreading misinformation and propaganda to fool people into believing that they're telling the truth? Why would they believe a CGI graphic over people that were on the ground, that went and filmed themselves in these places, proving that there was nothing there, and disbelieving the people? Every person in the hospital, for example, was a doctor, a nurse, or some kind of belonged to that a health worker of some description. There was no Hezbollah operatives there. There was no there was nothing untoward there whatsoever. But this was a classic example of Israel softening up public opinion. So this is what they're doing. And like, as we've already discussed, they have the whole of the Western media as part of their army. Although BBC, I don't know if you saw, but they deployed Ola Gurin. This is like, we're deploying the big guns now. And of course, she didn't come with the rest of us. She had her own private tour of the hospital, walk around. And you could see, and if you watch it, I recommend anybody to watch it, because she walks around and the look on her face when she doesn't find anything untoward there and go is priceless. She has to begrudgingly say, there's nothing here, nothing to see. And that was a little bit of a moment there, because the BBC, of course, huge supporters of Israel. And
she's probably regretting that she was assigned this post, because she's going to have to pay for questioning the word of the chosen people. And look, you served in terms of your media coverage, in two zones right now that are the future of is going to be determined by the new president, Trump. So there's a lot of talk about Trump ending wars, and maybe he's going to stop the war in Ukraine or stop the war here. I personally don't, have a different opinion, but what's your opinion about how this new coming president will affect these two war zones?
I mean, obviously there is going to be an impact. The new president, Trump, will have his own erratic path. We don't know. I mean, on foreign policy, he's, he'll say one thing. So, for example, he's spoken about ending wars. And he says there's all this talk of a truce in Lebanon, but there's no detail about how that truce is going to come about, or what that truce looks like from his perspective. And so he gives these contradictory statements, saying that he's going to end wars on the one hand, but on the other, he's saying, well, I'm going to tackle. We need to defeat Hamas. We need to defeat Hezbollah. Well, how do those two things reconcile with each other? And of course, Trump is the biggest supporter of Israel on the planet. Look, I mean, Trump. There's this. I think again a misconception of what Trump is about, because the Biden-Harris administration was appalling. Its legacy is going to be one of facilitating a massacre, genocide of Palestinians, facilitating the conflict in Ukraine and the slaughter of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians. That's their legacy. That's what they'll be remembered for. So people are understandably wanting to sweep that into the dustbin of history. But who do they replace them with? Well, somebody who has a war criminal. I don't think there's ever been a US president that hasn't been a war criminal. Trump was the guy who ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, and in a drone strike in Baghdad International Airport. This was a war crime, and one that Iran rightly wants him to be held accountable and brought to justice for. In terms of, and of course, within Israel, he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. He recognized the Golan Heights as Israeli sovereign territory completely. I mean, even the international community, as whatever that means, but even they don't recognize the Golan as.
And when he was president, he didn't stop the war in Ukraine either.
No, of course he didn't. No, of course he didn't. And that's the point: is that if people think the war started in February 2022, and if they think the massacre of Palestinians only started on October the 7th, that's their benchmark. And if he stops that, then he stopped the war. But of course, this was going on during his presidency. He was fueling both of those. I don't want to use the term conflict, because they're not conflicts. They're massacres, they're genocides, they're not conflicts. They're not even wars, really, in that respect. But Trump, he's incredibly erratic, but I think he'll inflame the situation particularly in this region. If he does, he may end the flow of arms to Ukraine. This isn't for altruistic reasons or for any reason. He doesn't necessarily support a Russian victory or anything like that, but he will have other concerns. His main concern, and the United States has been very open that they see their main enemy as China. So I think you might see a shift away from. I mean, this region will always be up in flames because of U.S. imperialism, and as long as Israel exists, it will continue that way. And Donald Trump is not going to shift that. There's going to be no shift in support for Israel. In fact, that support will probably harden, if anything, I think, rather than soften. So, which is going to be bad news for the people of this region. I think he'll embolden Israel to continue in a much more violent and aggressive way than it's doing now. I think that my fear is that the truce that he's proposing for Lebanon will be essentially the occupation of southern Lebanon under what auspices that will be, whether it's a multinational force, including Israel. I think that's the kind of thing I think that Trump might have in mind, essentially the expansion of Israel. I think in terms of Ukraine, again, we'll see a similar situation. We've heard the reports that I've heard for his proposal for a peaceful resolution is to have British troops stationed along along the border.
Return of the British occupation of Lebanon from 1940.
Exactly. So I mean, if your plans are giving territory to the enemy, which is how we would have to view them, then these are plans that are not going to be successful. They're not going to bring peace to any of those regions.
Well, to just end on a funny note, in the last 3 days there was clashes between Zionist supporters of the Maccabi Tel Aviv in the streets of Amsterdam with Arab and Muslim citizens of Holland. We spoke about how media is so compliant to orders of the Zionists. We look at how the mainstream media covered this incident and how the Western elite all fell into line.
It was astonishing. Really.
So what's your assessment on this and the future of the Muslim and Arab diaspora communities as this conflict expands?
Well, I think you're right to end on describe it as a funny note, really, because look, the facts were Maccabi Tel Aviv, that very famous European city, playing in a European football tournament, arrived in Amsterdam for a European match, one that they lost heavily. I'm pleased to report 5-0. So obviously the Ajax team are anti-Semitic for
not losing.
For not losing. They always say Israel has the right to defend itself, but it proved completely incapable on the football field as well as it does everywhere else.
If they don't have F-35s bombing the other team, they're not going to win.
Well, I was expecting that they were going to come out and stop bombing the other team and firing RPGs or something in the second half, but they got a thrashing on the pitch. But off the pitch, what we saw, and Maccabi Tel Aviv fans have a reputation of being racist, violent, much like the state that they belong to. And in the days preceding the match, they arrived, they were making racist chants, kill all the Arabs. There were no children in Palestinian schools because they're all dead. They were tearing down Palestine flags, burning them. They were roaming the streets, beating up a taxi driver, I believe a Moroccan taxi driver, if I'm not incorrect. So this really kind of set the tone. And then inside the stadium, a minute's silence. And this was a minute's silence for victims of a flood in Spain, in Valencia. And they refused to respect a minute's silence for that. This wasn't like a minute.
You remember one of the ministers in the Israeli government when the floods happened in Valencia said this is God's punishment for Spain. Was starting a boycott of the Zionists.
Exactly.
So the Maccabi fans are just like the ministers.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can't separate that. Actually, I think that's a very good point. But I'm a big football fan, right? I've been to football matches. I was a season ticket holder, And football fans don't mess about, right? And there's often, a good old punch up and whatever. So the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans, when they left the stadium, people had seen this behavior, people were outraged at this behavior. And like the Arab and Muslim diaspora, of course, were not overly happy. But it was, and listen, look, I view this as the same as they do everywhere. Israelis will often start a fight that they can't win, right? So it's kind of a microcosm of that, really. It's what's happening here in Lebanon, it's what's happening in Gaza. And of course, they went out onto the streets, and again, they were making these racist chants, and people didn't like it very much. They took umbrage and beat the shit out of them.
Do you think the King of Holland received a call from the ambassador to issue that statement?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, the initial reports actually were very different. So Sky News they covered it, and they covered it correctly. They gave the details of what actually happened, but then Sky News pulled it.
And they published a new one.
A new one, exactly.
With the opposite of the story.
With the opposite of what they were saying. So everybody then, even those kind of outliers, and the Daily Mail actually, which a notoriously right-wing racist newspaper, actually published a very good article on it, and again laid out the facts as they were. But I think the upshot of this now is Maccabi Tel Aviv are going to find it very difficult. I mean, the reaction, we need to evacuate all citizens, all Jewish citizens, all Israelis must leave Amsterdam immediately. It was this hysteria. But everybody saw what happened. Their lies are being exposed in front of the eyes of the world. Everybody can see what's happening now. And I think the same in Gaza.
I enjoyed the fact that they abused the word pogrom and Kristallnacht.
Yeah.
So badly, because we had a year of them abusing. We had years of them abusing the word Holocaust to justify. Yeah. But now, after a year of seeing the genocide, the Holocaust in Gaza, it used, it lost all its luster, this word Holocaust, and the ability for them to abuse it to justify killing Palestinians and colonizing. And now, this two still wars that may had some triggering effect within Western populations, pogrom and Kristallnacht, and now they just threw them in the gutter. Now everybody have seen that the Zionist hooligans were trying to actually implement a pogrom against the Arab and Muslim community of Holland, and it's being called a pogrom to resist the pogrom.
Yeah, exactly. It's bizarre, isn't it? It really is quite bizarre, unless you know how the media functions and you understand how the media functions. But I think now this isn't the last game that they have to play. So I think after people have seen what happened in Amsterdam, when they come to another European city, wherever that is, and I really hope that they have to play Glasgow Celtic. Yeah. This is my dream. The dream fixture.
It's your Irish background.
Yeah, this is my dream fixture. But I think everywhere they go, they're going to meet resistance now. Not just from the Arab and Muslim communities, diaspora communities, because it wasn't just them that were involved in the attacks on the supporters. And they weren't attacks, they were people fighting back, essentially, and fighting back in their community. But it united the Arab and Muslim diaspora with the ordinary people, Dutch people.
Yeah. So we saw the demonstration today in one of the major cities in Holland. Huge crowds, mainly of Dutch people, not from immigrant backgrounds. And we also saw that 13-year-old kid covering the hooligans coming out of the stadium, doing the job of all the Western media together. And so you could see that the power, the media humiliated itself yesterday.
Absolutely.
All the Western elite humiliated themselves, because this was worse than, I think, as a propaganda failure, than even trying to claim the resistance in Gaza is committing rapes and so forth.
Yeah. I'm going to buy myself an Ajax shirt.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes. And thank you very much, Steve, for being with us. We've taken a lot of your time. There's so much to talk about we wish you the best of luck in your work here covering and safety. And we hope to be able to interview you again once more
I'd be
later
very
on
happy.
as we liberate Palestine.
Yes.
Thank you all for watching. This was Wartime Cafe, episode 15. Visit our website, freepalestine.video. Share the content, donate, and follow us on all the socials. Until we see you next time, I bid you all a free Palestine.